So thanks a lot, Stefano. Thanks a lot for everyone for the great workshop. So indeed, as Stefano said, I'm going to present the research that we are doing together with my colleagues, Aleksandra Urman from the University of Bern and Zurich, and Roberto Ulloa from GESIS. And you can see the title on the screen. So just to briefly introduce you why we're actually interested in the search engine bias. As pretty much everyone here on this workshop knows, I guess, search engines such as Google or Bing serve as information intermediaries today. So they're pretty much informing users about different topics and entities. However, there are also some problems with this very important function of informing both individuals and societies, because search outputs can also be systematically skewed towards a specific group or individual, and it's how we actually understand bias in our research. The problem with such bias is that it can actually lead to the distorted representation of the issue which is searched for or represented through the search engine. And it is particularly problematic because we know that users actually highly trust search engines. So according to the recent Edelman barometer, people might actually be trusting search engine outputs even more than the journalistic media, which are usually viewed as the most reliable source of information. And we're also knowing that quite a broad range of users, such as journalists and educators, that actually relying on the image search in order to get data about the specific phenomena. And because they're also pretty influential in informing other parts of our society, the bias in the search engine outputs might actually lead to the distorted representation and even lead to the discrimination. So there is quite some research done on the image search bias in relation to the representation of gender and race, which are really highly problematic and complex phenomena. However, not so much is done on bias in other issues, including technological innovation and including artificial intelligence that we are working with for this project. And the literature suggests pretty much that innovation in the West might actually be biased in terms of the representation. Specifically, there are strong associations of technology with masculinity and also whiteness. And this influence can actually have quite substantial effect on the career choices. So for instance, if I'm seeing that a certain field is exclusively white or masculine, and if I'm not actually white and masculine, then it might actually influence my eagerness to join this field. Similarly, it might actually affect the hiring decision for this kind of field. And finally, put technology above the discriminated groups if, for instance, technology is really framed as masculine and whitish. So pretty much the contributions that we are making in this paper are twofold. So first of all, we introduced a mixed method approach for detecting bias in search outputs. And specifically, we want to account for the personalization and randomization in this method. And then we're also applying this method to cross-engine comparison of AI representation. So just to briefly introduce the related work, again, as pretty much everyone here knows, there is a growing interest in the field of information retrieval in race and gender bias in different contexts, specifically in the text search and, let's say, query auto-completion. But what we found when we started working on this project is that image search still looks to be quite understudied. There are some very good studies, such as, for instance, Kay, looking on the bias in Google representation of the certain occupations and the role of gender in this occupation. And Kay actually found that there is quite some exaggeration of disbalance in terms of the gender in the search output. So Google actually amplifies the image of the male or female dominated professions. Similarly, Otto Bacher actually looked on the Bing and found that males are usually presented as more competent and purpose-oriented in the image search outputs, and they are more commonly retrieved for the gender-neutral queries such as persona. And there are also quite a couple of studies which looking on the race representation. So Sophia Noble, for instance, looked on the Google and actually finds that there is quite a number of racist and misogynic representations in the image search output, specifically related to women and also minorities. And Aya Ujo actually conducted one of the very few comparative studies when she looked at the Google and Bing and found that there is positive stereotypization of the white women and more negative stereotypization of non-white women. So what is we actually wanted to do, as I already noted, is to look on the case study of the racial and gender representation of AI. And in the case of technology in general, we know that its perception and representation is a complex assemblage of technical and social constructs. And it's probably particularly true in the case of AI, which is by definition deals with a combination of technical and social aspects, and also is commonly anthropomorphized. We also know from literature that the AI anthropomorphization in West is quite skewed both in popular culture and industry implementations. So in terms of the ways, there is really strong tendency to use white surfaces for producing human-like robots. And also when we're looking on the Western popular culture, there is really a lot of white robots such as Terminator and Blade Runner. And there are just recently we're starting to actually having more mainstream images of non-white AIs, such as in the case of the Westworld. In the case of the gender, it is less, I would say, skewed, even while in the case of the virtual assistants, such as Siri Cortana, we often have femininization, and also there are multiple feminine AIs in the pop culture, such as in the case of Her, Ghost in the Shell, or Classic Metropolis. So in the case of the gender, there might even be a stronger skew towards the female representations, albeit there are also multiple male AI representations. So against this backdrop, what we actually wanted to do is we wanted to collect some data from the search image outputs and then analyze them using our mixed method. So we collected data in February 2020 for 4 Western and 2 non-Western search engines, which are the most commonly used in the world. And specifically, we looked on Bing, DuckDuckGo, Google, Yahoo, Baidu, and Yandex. We used virtual agent-based approach, so we simulated user behavior using scripted action to generate inputs and then recorded outputs in the form of HTML. Specifically for each agent, we used a relatively simple sequence, so we scripted each agent to open the browser at the same time, navigate to the image search page, and we used conversion, then enter artificial intelligence queries and scroll down the results, and then shift to the next page. And our aim was actually to collect 5 pages of the image search outputs. And we implemented it using 2 browser extensions, the bot and the tracker, which were installed on 100 Clean CentOS OS machines in the Frankfurt region of Amazon EC2. We installed our agents in 2 browsers. So in the end, it provided us 200 agents. So we used 100 machine in 2 browsers, Chrome and Firefox on each machine. So we got 200 agents. And we controlled for the location and time using the same range of IPs from the Frankfurt and starting the agents at the same time. And we also made sure that there is no interaction history. So we used the clean machines as well as the clean browser versions to limit personalization. We also specifically aim to use a large number of agents to actually account for the randomization of the outputs and also the possibility of search engines actually guessing the demographics of the agents using from the search activity. So at the same time, it's really important to know that despite we assigned the same number of agents to each search engine, which was around 34, not all of them managed to complete the routine because of the captchas in the bot detection mechanism. So you see here the number of agents which actually completed the routine, and as you see, the Yandex was really the strictest in terms of actually detecting the bot activity. In terms of the analysis, we looked at the top 30 image results for each agent, which were aggregated in 3 groups. So we specifically looked distinctively on the results from 1 to 10, from 10 to 20, and from the 20 to 30 to see if there is variation in terms of the gender and race representation based on the ranking. And as you also see here is a general number of images for each group. As you see, there is quite some randomization involved for Bing and Google, who actually do not use necessarily the same set of the image outputs for the specific diapason of the 10 results. So for instance, in the Bing, we got 16 different images for the top 10 results. For the Google, the same for the results from 11 to 20. And what we did then with our outputs is we coded them using 2 coders who labeled images based on 3 categories. So we specifically were interested in whether or not the image of AI shows anthropomorphic features, such as human-like figures or parts of human bodies. Then we actually looked on the race of the anthropomorphic images, so whether or not it is white, whether or not it is not white, whether or not it's really not possible to understand based on the image, or is it something very abstract, such as some kind of bluish or greenish figures. And then we used sex as a proxy for the gender, because gender is a really very complex phenomenon. So it's much easier to operationalize as binary sex. And we used on whether or not images were female, male, unknown, mixed, or abstract again. And as you see, we reached relatively decent intercoder reliability with scriptender alpha, which is acceptable for the quite complex tasks that we are dealing with. And just before I will move to the findings, a couple of points about how we actually operationalize bias. So unfortunately, there is no clear baseline for AI representation, unlike for instance, gender representativeness for the specific occupation for which we can actually find statistics. However, if you use the notion of unequal retrievability introduced by Otto Bacher that understands bias as a different accessibility of the outputs with specific characteristics. And basically, if specific characteristics are really much more accessible, much more retrievable, then it might actually be viewed as a form of bias, which leads to the distorted perceptions. So what we actually found in our study in the end, so as we see, first of all, there is definitely a very strong tendency to provide anthropomorphic outputs for the image search results for the artificial intelligence query. So specifically for the Yandex, the largest Russian search engine, basically all the images retrieved were showing anthropomorphic figures or parts of the human bodies. And generally for all the Western search engines, the proportion is extremely high. It basically goes usually above the 90% of all search outputs. The only exception is Chinese search engine, Baidu, and usually indeed the images that we got either show human brains in a highly stylized manner or general human-like figures similar to the classic shining robots. Then when we actually looked at the racial representation of AI, then what we found is that there is generally quite strong tendency to show AI as white. There is definitely some difference between non-Western and Western agents, especially because non-Western agents really emphasize the image of AI as white, especially on the very top results from the first to 10th result. In the case of the Western search engines, the tendency is reversed. So on the very first 10 results, they usually focusing on more abstract images, so not necessarily racialized images of AI, but the longer you actually go, the deeper you go into the search outputs, the more racialized they're becoming. What is also pretty concerning is that there is almost no non-white images of the AI. Basically, the only search engines which provide some are non-Western ones, Baidu and Yandex, and the maximum diversity for the Western ones are images which are really not easy to attribute to the specific race, such as images of the human hands, which are so badly lit that you cannot really understand what is the race of the owner of those human hands. In the case of the gender, we're actually finding again similar situation, albeit less skewed. So in the case of the Western search engines, we have very strong focus on the images of AI as a feminine and pretty much almost no male images of the AI. Even while in both cases, both in the non-Western and Western agents, there is much more stronger focus on gender neutral or abstract images of the AI. In the case of non-Western ones, we're actually having a reverse focus. We're having more images of the AI as male one, which can probably be related to the popular culture representation of artificial intelligence. We do not know that much about China, but at least in the case of Russia, there is definitely strong tendency to represent AI as more male one based on the popular culture. But again, as we're seeing, there is definitely not so much diversity in the representation. And again, the more diverse representations are actually found in the non-Western cases. So what kind of the discussion can we make in the end? What kind of findings can we do? So there's definitely a certain gender and racial skewness in representation of AI in image search outputs. There's also strong focus on AI representation through the prism of whiteness, specifically in the case of race, which pretty much leads to the remittance of the non-white AI developers and designs. The skewness can be attributed to the different factors, as we guess. First of all, the Western authoritative sources, such as the journalistic websites, the governmental websites, probably reiterate white images. And also, probably, as we know, there is high probability that they mainly rely on the accompanying text to actually generate the image search outputs and not actual image analysis. And then it's really very hard to differentiate between white and non-white images of AI. And basically it means that search engines do not necessarily create bias, but they do reiterate it for the race and to a certain degree for gender, albeit to a lesser degree. And because it is actually less present in the case of gender, because we know that gender representation of AI is way less biased, that actually gives some hope that also the racial bias can be addressed. And finally, it is also important to note some limitations that we found in our study. So first of all, we used pretty binary classifications for the race and gender classification. We used just only the snapshot experiment, and our experimental setup might also affect our findings in certain ways. And for the future work, we're definitely looking forward to reproduce the study and also expand it. So thank you very much.